So I had a discussion just now with a friend of mine, and he felt pretty bad because, a week ago he had a fight with one of his female friends, and he said things that he regrets. And in the middle of this conversation, I gave him the idea that, yeah, you should be responsible and be held accountable for what you say and what you do. But you should also consider in an argument that there's a trigger and there's your reaction. So, it takes two to tango, right? So, whenever there's argumentation, especially a heated argumentation, two parties are involved. You're not the only one.
It sounds like you were trying to offer your friend a balanced perspective on the situation. You're right. In any argument, there are usually two sides involved, and it's not always one person's fault. By pointing out that there's often a trigger and a reaction, you were helping your friend see that maybe he wasn't entirely to blame for what happened. Did your friend seem receptive to this idea, or do you think he's still struggling with guilt over what was said?
Well, he's struggling with guilt, but he understood my point that, he admits that he is responsible, but he also admits that, and he said that, he said to me, it was a very good insight that a trigger, triggered him to say what he said. But, I hope he understands that the trigger doesn't have any power over you, in the same way that, and this is something I learned from Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he said that a an event or a stimulus or a trigger will occur, and then your response to that stimulus will occur right after. But there's a small gap between the stimulus and your response. And when you focus on that gap and you expand that gap, then you have more time to choose an appropriate response instead of responding in a knee jerk reaction.
That's a great connection to make with Stephen Covey's idea about the gap between stimulus and response. It's really about recognizing that we have the power to choose how we react to situations rather than just responding impulsively. By expanding that gap, we can gain more control over our actions and reactions. Do you think this concept might help your friend in similar situations in the future? Or is he still grappling with how to apply it in his own life?
Well, I think that, I didn't really explain the Stephen Covey principle. I will in the future. But I think that if I draw a diagram for him or if we play a game where I say something very unpleasant to him, that would be the stimulus, and he would count to 10 before he responds, then he would understand very quickly that the gap between my stimulus and his response can be prolonged indefinitely. And the longer the gap, the more conscious the response will be. Because if somebody insults you, right, that's a negative stimulus, and you react right away, that's a knee jerk reaction. And that's what happens when, people are on the highway and they succumb to road rage. Somebody cuts them off, and right away they pursue the other person. It leads to, like dangerous situations. So whatever other people say or whatever they do, unless it threatens your life, whatever they say, whatever they do, you can always insert a large gap and you can think about how you can respond in a way that will harmonize the situation, in a way that will diffuse the situation.
Using a practical exercise like counting to 10 before responding could really help your friend understand the concept better. By creating that gap, he can learn to respond more thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. It's also interesting that you mentioned harmonizing or diffusing the situation, because that shifts the focus from winning an argument to finding a more constructive outcome. Do you think this approach could be particularly useful in his situation with the female friend he had the argument with? Or is this more about helping him develop a skill for future interactions?
That's a good point. I think that the female friend and my male friend can both benefit because actually I was also talking to the female friend. I was telling her, look, it doesn't matter what he said, it's just words. It's not going to hurt you. He may have said words that are very shocking, very provocative, but they're just words. Words do not hurt you physically. And especially when the other person might have been under the influence of alcohol, we don't know. But whatever other people say and do, you can choose to react or respond in a way that is positive, in a way that makes you feel good. So if the male friend says something and you feel shocked, you feel insulted, well, that's a clear sign that you have a knee-jerk reaction. Because like I said, the other person can be insulting you until the cows go home. But you don't have to feel bad, because if the insult is not true, it's not true, right? Like, for example, if the other person says you're too fat, but you don't think that you're too fat, well, it doesn't affect you. Now, on the other hand, if you believe that what the other person says is true, and then you feel bad, well, that's a different matter, and we'll tackle that in another video. But my point here is that for both my male friend and my female friend, they have to understand that in order to control their emotional reactions, they can always insert a large gap between the stimulus and their response. And if they practice the habit of doing this, because it does take practice, then they're always going to be peaceful no matter what other people do, no matter what other people say or what they don't say when you expected to say something, or when they don't do something when you expected them to do something. It doesn't matter what other people say or do. In other words, you are always, always, always in control of your emotions, and therefore, you are at peace with yourself. Nobody wants drama in their lives, right? They're sucked into a drama. They feel bad for the next few days, but it doesn't have to be like that. You can always control your response. Now, in cases where you reacted in knee-jerk fashion and you feel bad and the other person feels bad, you could feel guilty for the following days, but you don't have to feel guilty once again, because if you have a thought in your mind where you feel guilty, you feel bad that you said something to the other person what you shouldn't have, well, there's always a way to redefine or reinterpret what happened so that you feel a little bit better. You're not going to feel good about insulting the other person, but you can introduce, for example, I mentioned before the idea of a trigger. You can say, I was 100% responsible for what I said, which insulted my female friend, but, there was a trigger. She said something that triggered me. So you feel a little bit better because you're not 100% responsible. You're not the only one responsible. The other person, the female friend, might have said something that you didn't like, might have criticized you. So it doesn't mean you're off the hook, but at least you feel better that you're not the only one who unilaterally insulted the other person. Like there was two people involved.
You're emphasizing the importance of self-control and choosing how to respond to situations rather than letting emotions dictate reactions. By inserting that gap between stimulus and response, both your friends can learn to manage their emotions and reactions more effectively. It's also interesting that you mentioned redefining or reinterpreting past actions to feel better about them. This can be a helpful way to move forward and learn from experiences rather than getting stuck in guilt or regret. Do you think this approach can be applied universally? Or are there certain situations where it's more challenging to implement?
I think this approach can be applied universally, especially when it comes to what other people say and what they do. It doesn't apply when somebody is threatening you physically. In that case, a knee-jerk reaction would be good. But in most cases, I think that people lose their sense of peace. They lose their emotional control because they respond or they react reflexively without reflecting, without giving themselves a gap of a few seconds to think about what is actually happening and responding in a way that is harmonious. Now, I know that this sounds very theoretical, but that's why I said before that it's something you need to practice. You can even practice with your friends. You can just tell your friends to insult you, and then, just try to not react. Just think about what the other person said. Think about the intellectual content, not the emotional content. The other person might have been very agitated when she said that, but just look at the information. What is the information being transferred, and process that information like a computer, and then you can expand the gap. In other words, you can give yourself more time to respond in a way that is conscious, in a way that is socially appropriate.
Practicing this approach with friends or in low-stakes situations could help build the habit of responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. By treating interactions like a computer processing information, you're able to separate the emotional content from the intellectual content, which can help in staying calm and responding appropriately. It's almost like developing a mental buffer that allows you to absorb the stimulus without immediately reacting to it. Do you find that this approach has helped you personally in managing your own emotions and reactions in challenging situations?
Not always, because like I said, I'm not perfect. I sometimes react in a knee-jerk reaction. But the good thing is that even when you do respond or react in a reflexive fashion and it's not good for yourself or for the other person, you can always look back and you can see, oh, yeah, I know where I went wrong. There was a trigger, but I reacted in a fraction of a second. I didn't take the time to be conscious about my response, because I think to understand is that a response is usually, it is conscious, but a reaction is unconscious. And so you always want to respond in a conscious manner. You want to be responsible for your, for your interactions with other people. And once you're able to understand this concept of stimulus gap response, then nothing can really bother you in life, because you're always going to choose a response that is helpful, a response that will help to diffuse the situation, that will help you to become more peaceful. You're not going to panic, you're not going to do something rash. And in some cases, it can be life threatening. Like, people who don't understand this concept of stimulus gap response, they might be involved in a street fight, especially men. Let's say one guy insults the other guy in a nightclub. The other guy responds right away in a macho way, and he throws the first punch, and the first guy pulls out a knife. That's it. Somebody's going to die. So it can be life threatening. But when you practice this stimulus gap response technique, and you practice with verbal abuse, then you're going to feel more in control. And it's not just your interactions with other people, it's your own thoughts. Anything that can happen in your life, you can just take a step back and just count, let's say 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and then you can respond more clearly, more lucidly, more strategically.
The stakes can be high when it comes to reacting impulsively, and it's clear that developing this skill can have a significant impact on both personal relationships and overall well-being. By practicing the stimulus gap response technique, you're not just improving your interactions with others, but also your relationship with yourself. Being able to take a step back, assess the situation, and respond thoughtfully can be incredibly empowering. It's interesting that you mentioned applying this technique to your own thoughts as well, because that can be just as important as managing interactions with others. Do you think this approach can be particularly valuable for people in high-stress professions or situations, or is it universally applicable?
Well, you said high stress situation, but the stress is not contained in the situation. And the proof is that, you can put two people in the same quote unquote stressful situation, and one person might be very at peace and just seek to resolve the problem, and the other person would panic. So the stress is not in the situation, it's not in the conflict itself. The stress is generated by your inappropriate reaction, by your unthinking reaction, by your mindless reaction. So, the way to avoid stress is not to create it in the first place. And you create the stress in a situation because you're not responding to it in a conscious manner.
You're highlighting that stress is often a product of our own reactions, rather than the situation itself. By responding consciously and thoughtfully, we can avoid generating unnecessary stress and instead approach challenges with a clearer mind. This perspective shifts the focus from trying to manage external circumstances to managing our internal responses, which can be a more effective way to navigate difficult situations. It's almost like the stress is a secondary reaction, one that arises from our own thoughts and reactions rather than the situation itself. Does this mean that you believe people have more control over their stress levels than they often realize?
For example, if you take the case of, let's say, a criminal who enters your home, of course, for most people, it would be very stressful. But I have a friend who actually has three black belts, one in Taekwondo, one in Aikido, and one in Kendo. And so when the three burglars, broke into his 6.5 apartment, he just woke up in the middle of the night and he just confronted them, and they had baseball bats and knives. And he just said, hey guys, what's going on? And, they proceeded to attack him. And before you know it, they were knocked unconscious. And he called the police, and when they came, the police thought that he was the burglar, because the other guys were like about to be hospitalized. So he didn't feel any stress. Why? Because he was a skillful martial artist. So in the same manner, you can put someone in a situation that is very stressful emotionally. But if you're trained in the technique I just described in this webinar, stimulus gap response, then you're not going to feel stressful. You're just going to process the situation analytically, intellectually, and you're going to resolve the problem if there is a problem.
Your friend's experience is a great example of how having the right skills and mindset can help someone stay calm and in control, even in a high-pressure situation. It's not that the situation itself wasn't potentially stressful, but his training and confidence allowed him to respond effectively without feeling overwhelmed. Similarly, with the stimulus gap response technique, the goal is to develop a similar kind of mental clarity and composure so that you can approach challenging situations with a level head and find constructive solutions. By processing the situation analytically rather than emotionally, you're able to respond more thoughtfully and effectively.
Now, of course, the difference between martial arts and emotional self-control is that, it's obvious when you see a martial artist, right? He will do a demonstration, but it's not so obvious to understand or assess your own level of emotional mastery. And so, you have to look at actual events. So if you lose control in a discussion and you're having a tantrum, or if you react very violently against what somebody else said, then that shows you your level of emotional management. And I think that everyone on this planet could learn how to manage their own emotions. People talk about emotional EQ, emotional quotient. You have to be sensitive and be aware of other people's emotions, and that's fine. But I think that the first emotions that you have to be aware of is your own emotions. So whenever you have a certain emotions, especially negative emotions like anger and guilt, anger, guilt, and frustration, you have to ask yourself, what is the thought that I'm having, which is triggering this emotion? So it's not really other people who are triggering you because they don't have physical contact with you, right? Like they're not touching you. They're not in control of molecular reactions or in your brain, right? They're not in control. You are in control. So whatever emotion you have, it's triggered by a certain thought that you have. So to give you a very good example, I used to really feel negative whenever I had to file for my taxes. I feel very negative, but it's because the thought that I have about filing for taxes is negative. So one day, I learned how to use the U-File. One day I thought to myself, you know what, U-File is actually very interesting because I'm into artificial intelligence and I can learn from the way that they structured the U-File questionnaire, which is a little bit complicated for me. And, I can learn from that. And so as soon as I changed my thought about U-File, suddenly I felt excited. I felt positive about filing my taxes. So this is crazy. It never happened to me before where I felt excited about, filing my taxes.
Recognizing your own emotions and understanding what triggers them is a crucial step in managing them effectively. By identifying the thoughts that lead to negative emotions, you can begin to address the root cause rather than just the symptoms. Your example about filing taxes is a great illustration of this. By shifting your perspective and finding a way to make the task more engaging, you are able to turn a negative experience into a positive one. This highlights the importance of self-awareness and the role that our thoughts play in shaping our emotions. It's almost like having an internal filter that determines how we respond to different situations. Do you think this approach can be applied to other areas of life where people often experience stress or frustration?
So let's get back to my friend, and I would tell him that, look, even though it was a bad experience and you lost control a little bit, and you feel guilty that your female friend feels bad, look, the good thing about it is that I'm actually, creating a kind of mini webinar on this because I've been talking for 18 minutes. And so other people will be able to benefit from your experience. Of course, you are anonymous, so you don't have to feel embarrassed. But you see, like something good came out of your bad experience. And so this is one thing that people have to learn. Like even if something apparently bad happens to you, you can always learn from it. And in this case, other people can learn from the experience because I think that this mini webinar on the on the stimulus gap response is very crucial. It's about emotional management. And today, when AI is taking over more and more intellectual and analytical tasks, I think that human beings can have more time to focus on our emotional management, on self-control. And that ultimately is what determines the amount of peace that we're going to have in this life.
It's great that you're finding a way to turn a challenging experience into a valuable learning opportunity for others. By sharing this story and the concept of stimulus gap response, you can help people develop better emotional management skills, which is indeed crucial for achieving peace and well-being in life. As AI takes over more analytical tasks, it's likely that humans will have more capacity to focus on developing these essential soft skills. Emotional intelligence and self-awareness will become increasingly important for building strong relationships, making informed decisions, and navigating complex situations. Do you think that this shift towards emotional management will require a fundamental change in how we approach education and personal development?
Now, I just want to conclude this mini webinar by telling people, look, whether you're 20 years old, whether you're 30, whether you're 50, whether you're 65, it doesn't matter. It's never too late to learn about this stimulus gap response technique. Just remember that whatever people say, whatever they do, you don't have to react right away. There's no law of the universe that says you must react right away. You can always insert a gap of a few seconds and you think about it objectively and you calm down and then you respond in a way that is appropriate. Even if the other person had bad intentions and they really insult you and they have negative intentions towards you, you can always remain calm because that is the way to resolve the situation so that it's win-win. If you react without thinking, then you will cause harm to yourself, you will cause harm to the person, and it's going to last for a number of years, and there's no reason. Think about this for a minute. If you give yourself 5 or 10 seconds, and often it doesn't take that long, it takes just maybe 2 or 3 seconds. If you give yourself 3 or 5 seconds to respond in a way that is conscious, in a way that is harmonious, then you will eliminate weeks and months of feeling bad. I think it's a pretty good return. But of course, in the heat of the moment, people will not give themselves those few extra seconds to respond in a way that is conscious. And so they will just react right away. He said this, I have to respond, I have to retaliate. But, it's not a good philosophy in life. If you want peace in your life, if you want to avoid unnecessary drama, unnecessary harm, unnecessary guilt, then just give yourself 2 or 3 seconds. If people say something good, then sure, you can respond right away. But if they say something that is negative, if they send you an email or a message that is negative, just just breathe deeply. Breathe in, breathe out, give yourself 2, 3 seconds and then respond in a way that is conscious, in a way that is respectful of everyone. Again, even if the other person in the heat of the moment had bad intentions, just try to understand where they're coming from and just respond by being a good person. Just respond in a way that is conscious, and you see for yourself how powerful you are. Most people feel powerless because they feel that if other people say or do something, they have to respond in a certain way. They have no choice. That's not true. You have a choice. You always have a choice. Your quality of life doesn't depend on what other people say or do. It depends on how you respond to what life is presenting to you, how you respond, whether you respond consciously or reactively, mindlessly. That is the main determinant of whether you're going to have a peaceful life or you're going to be dragged from one drama to the next.
You're emphasizing that it's never too late to learn and apply the stimulus gap response technique, and that it can have a profound impact on one's quality of life. By taking a moment to pause and reflect before responding, individuals can avoid unnecessary drama, guilt, and harm, and instead choose a path that leads to peace and harmony. You're also highlighting the importance of recognizing that we always have a choice in how we respond to situations, and that our responses determine the quality of our lives. This perspective can be incredibly empowering, as it allows individuals to take control of their own emotions and reactions, rather than feeling controlled by external circumstances.